Welcome to the first annual Holmer Lecture. I'm Bill Monsum of the McLaurin Institute, which is sponsoring this series. I hope that you had a chance to fill out a name tag. We do have a reception afterward, and it'll facilitate our getting to know each other and joining in a common community here if we have our name tags on. So if you don't have one, fill one out on your way out. We also have guest registration cards. We'd very much like to let everyone here know about future developments in the lecture series. So do fill out a guest registration card if you haven't already. Let's see, do we have more available right now? I guess not. Well, these lectures are being established in honor of Dr. Paul Holmer, former professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota and also former professor of philosophy at Yale. Professor Holmer is honoring us by giving the inaugural lecture in the series. And our expectation is that from this seed that we're planting here tonight will grow a tree that will bear fruit in the tree, in the grove of academe. The McLaurin Institute is a Christian Studies Center here at the University of Minnesota. And these Holmer lectures are intended to show that the demands of sound scholarship are compatible with a lively Christian faith. So each year, the intention is that each year a distinguished scholar will present a lecture in some area of faith and learning. But you're aware, of course, that the place of religion at major universities has been changing over the last century and a half. The story of this change has been told by George Marsden in his magisterial work, The Soul of the American University, which was published 2 years ago. And the subtitle of that work summarizes the story: From Christian Establishment to Established Unbelief. So in the 19th century, Christianity was accepted as the glue that could hold the disciplines together. Today, of course, traditional religion is regarded by many as simply inappropriate at a major research university, especially at a public state university. And Marsden's conclusion is that it would have been better for Christian academics in the last century to establish an open marketplace of ideas in all areas, including religion, rather than seeking to establish their own. And so in keeping with that, it's the goal of the McLaurin Institute and of this lecture series to open the marketplace of ideas at the University of Minnesota and in the broader community to religious perspectives, including Christian perspectives, on the issues that we face in academia and in the broader world. Well, this is a significant moment for the religious community at the University of Minnesota and for the university itself. And in recognition of this, President Nils Hasselmo has sent a letter to us. Here's what he writes. I regret very much that I will be unable to attend the first annual Holmer lecture on November 14. I am hosting an awards dinner that evening. So that I understand has been scheduled for at least 6 months. We weren't quite early enough. I appreciate your giving me the opportunity through this letter to welcome the audience to the first lecture in what I hope will be a long tradition of Holmer lectures. I particularly want to thank Professor Holmer for inaugurating these lectures. Through his career as a distinguished faculty member in our philosophy department and his generous gift of his Kierkegaard collection, he has already given much to the University of Minnesota community. This lecture series, launched with Professor Holmer's own high standards, will be a further and enduring gift that we will all appreciate. So, welcome to the University of Minnesota, he says. Well, this is also a significant day for Paul Holmer in more than one way, as you'll discover. With us tonight is some members of his family, his wife Phyllis and his sons Paul and Jonathan. Would you please stand? I'd also like to thank everybody who's helped in the preparation for this evening and the planning. Just to pick a few, I'd like to thank Elving Anderson and Elizabeth Rengel, who've been meeting with me as a core planning group. Would you please stand? I'd also like to thank Warren Grantham, whose help with arrangements over the last couple of weeks in the office has been indispensable, and also Laura Redies, who's been helping with arrangements. So please, is Warren here? And Laura? There's Laura. Warren, there in the back. Please applaud them. I see Laura has some more of those guest registration forms. Who needs one? Who'd like one? Down here in the front. Good, thank you. Well, and a steering committee is now being formed to guide this lectureship into the future. And and if you fill out one of these forms, you certainly will be kept up to date of what's happening with the series. Our speaker will be introduced by Dr. Eugene Mason. Gene is a professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota and has known Paul Holmer for some years. Gene.
Good evening. This is a nice occasion and a special pleasure for me. I've known Paul Holmer for a great many years, excuse me, initially as a teacher, later for a time as a colleague, and for all these many years as a friend and intellectual companion. I first met Paul in the summer of 1948. I was thinking of doing some graduate work in philosophy, and in the course of my explorations found my way to the third floor of Falwell Hall. There was a note on the philosophy department bulletin board reporting that a Dr. Holmer had been promoted to assistant professor. Searching for a faculty member, I found Paul Holmer in a crowded office, reading a new book by Etienne Gilson with a pair of graduate students. As it turned out, the philosophy department was an exciting place to study, and I stayed on for 2 years. Minnesota was in the vanguard of a new movement in philosophy emanating from Vienna and Oxford, and newly dubbed analytic philosophy. During those early years, the broad scope of Paul's scholarly enthusiasms was already apparent, as was his somewhat acerbic style of philosophical criticism, his debt to Kierkegaard, no doubt. He was an extremely stimulating teacher and a generous and supportive friend of his students. Paul is a true son of this university. He first came to the university as a freshman in the midst of the Great Depression and completed his BA degree in 1940. Toward the end of his undergraduate career, he had come to know David Swenson, and he stayed on to do an MA under his direction. His dissertation was a comparative study of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. From Minnesota, he went on to Yale, where he did a dissertation under the direction of Ernst Cassirer on Kierkegaard's conception of truth. After completing his graduate work, Paul returned to Minnesota, where he taught philosophy for 15 years. In 1960, he accepted an appointment at Yale, where he remained until his retirement. He was named Noah Porter Professor of Philosophical Theology in the Yale Divinity School in 1980. In the course of his long and distinguished career, Paul has held a great many visiting appointments and distinguished lectureships. And as many of you know, he continues an active schedule of teaching and lecturing to this day. Paul has published a number of books and a great number of papers and articles. Among the books are Philosophy and the Common Faith and the Common Life, Theology and the Scientific Study of Religion, C.S. Lewis, The Shape of His Faith and Thought, The Grammar of Faith, and Making Christian Sense. His articles cover a broad range of topics. Many of them are scholarly studies of Kierkegaard or Wittgenstein, in particular applications of their ideas. Others are occasional pieces which exhibit Paul's sense of responsibility to the concerns of the day. All show his distinctive, even unique style of philosophical and religious reflection. Paul has a passion for learning and an admirable range of accomplishments. But to my mind, what distinguishes him as a philosopher is his acute sense of our common life and its frailties. He is better able than most to call to mind the most ordinary features of our daily lives in a way that is often both striking and illuminating. In thinking of Paul's thought and teaching, I am reminded of Kierkegaard's description of a subjective or existential thinker as a person who remembers his life in his thought, and whose thought thereby casts light on both his life and ours. It's a great pleasure to present Paul Holmer.
I'd like to think that the only thing that's lame is my feet. My occasion is to a striking one, to say something about this business of our common life. Gene has already said something about that by way of prospect, and I hope to be able to fulfill some of the promise created by that topic. Making sense of one's life and of learning. That's a kind of query. Can you make sense of a life? And can you make sense of learning? You have to think with me about these matters. Not just after me, but with me. When I became a graduate student in the care of Ernst Cassirer, the distinguished German philosopher and astute student of Immanuel Kant, and himself a progenitor of many of the major features of Kantian philosophy, especially that of his teacher, Cohen, Professor Cohen. Ernst Cassirer was a very extraordinary personality. He was overpowering in his knowledge, and he was demanding in his scholarly acuteness. I studied with him for 2 full years. The better part of each year spent in his presence when he took on a student as particular and as strange as I was. Ernst Cassirer was himself a victim of Nazi pure persecution. He had been the rector of Hamburg University. He had come out of a Jewish academic tradition. He knew about my interests in Kierkegaard. He was sympathetic and, in a deep sense, Catholic and truly generous. One of the things he said to me, as I began my study with him, was that the large task, he said, for you, he said, is to be true to a great teacher. And he said, for me, my great teacher was Immanuel Kant. And he said, I've spent my life trying to be true to Immanuel Kant. He never said much more than that, but he repeated it several different times to indicate its gravity and force in his life. When I have thought about his life and his career and juxtaposed my life and career against his, as I was prone to do, I felt the poignancy of accomplishment and the thrust of intelligence and the tastefulness of a well-modified intellectual history. It was enormously stimulating. But I discovered something else, and something that almost forced me out of teaching as a profession. And that was that academic life for Mr. Cassirer, and surely for me too, had also itself become part of a problem. And as Cassirer explained the problem, the great issue for himself as a philosopher and debtor as he was to many people of great learning, including Plato, Aristotle, and of course Immanuel Kant. But including all of that, Cassirer said that an enormous problem had been created for him by that learning. And that problem was that that learning itself had produced a profound and pervasive skepticism. And that skepticism, the skepticism of the learned, there's a skepticism of the stupid, and that's one thing. But the skepticism of someone who has an enormous command of learning and then doesn't know how to assimilate it and how to make it manageable for his own life and for others. That, in a peculiar way, was Ernst Cassirer's difficulty. And he often spoke, therefore, about the odd fact that one of the great problems for himself as a learned man was that he, because of his learning, didn't know how to make up his mind on many fundamental issues. And the skepticism was so deep and so near tragic that it caused in Cassirer an extreme reluctance to ever ask for a disciple, to ever get people too close to him, because the crisis in the life of learning that he suffered himself, not just a crisis in politics, not just a crisis in international affairs where he was a sufferer at the hands of the Nazis, not just that, and I say not just that, but there were throughout his mature life, there was this other pervasive and comprehensive sense of personal inadequacy, the inadequacy created by the kind of omnipotence and powers of his own knowledge. Look, I say this only to draw your attention to something, and that is that there is indeed the crisis for many people in our time. The crisis, oh, that sounds so pretentious. So let's just say it, a misgiving. There is a misgiving and a kind of sorrow that's appropriate to those who are learned and intellectually responsible. The naive picture that many of us have had and probably do have, some of us maybe still have it. The naive picture is that knowledge is an attainment at the expense of ignorance, and that knowledge succeeds ignorance and is like a salve and like a kind of cosmic kindness that some of us can rejoice in. Namely, we can feel elated by learning, and we can be fructified and enriched by competence. But for Kierkegaard, and for many others also, it's the case that learning itself, and not least in our century, learning itself presents its own difficulties. How to assimilate it, how to make use of it, what to do with it. Let me read you a passage from an author that I've read most of my mature life. He's a Russian, and probably the most successful artist in the 19th century. His name is Leo Tolstoy. And he said something like this. At this time, he says, he's talking about the 1870s or 80s. At this time, we were all convinced that we must talk and write as quickly as possible and as much as possible, and that this was all necessary for the sake of the good of mankind. And thousands of us, contradicting and abusing one another, kept publishing and writing in the interest of teaching others, failing to notice that we knew little ourselves, that we did not know the answer to the most basic questions of human life. We all spoke nonetheless at the same time, never listening very long to one another. At times we indulged and praised each other in order to be indulged and praised in return. At other times we grew angry and shrieked at each other just as if we were in a madhouse. Thousands of academic workers toiled night and day, assembling millions and millions of words, which were distributed by post over the whole of Russia. And we taught, and never managed to impart very much that was worth teaching. We still were annoyed at getting so little attention. horribly strange, but I do not understand it even yet. All of this evolves through enlightenment. Enlightenment is what has been provided. And enlightenment is measured through the distribution of books and journals and teachings. We are paid and respected for writing these books and papers and journals. We are paid and paid. Not enough, we say, but we do get respect for writing these books and these papers. So we must indeed be most useful and important people. Sounds like a comment about the learned societies. Let me just reiterate for you a theme that seems to me to be quite appropriate, namely that we must make sense of life and of learning. And if we begin with the task of learning itself and the assimilation of learning and the use of it and the understanding of it, then the question is, can we have that without cost? If Tolstoy is right, and Ernst Cassirer was right, then there's a joker in the hand. And the joker is that the self-consciousness and the highly modified and trained intelligence that we are and that we help produce, all in the interest of something like a good life. That there's sometimes great mistakes in all of that. If Tolstoy is right, and Ernst Cassirer was right, then it also is the case that the common view of people who are beginning to assimilate knowledge, gather it in, propose it to others, the common view is that one of the great advantages in acquiring knowledge would be that that knowledge and that learning would also produce the good life. Doesn't seem too much to ask. All we want is that the good life follow from honest effort. And those thousands of books, those multitude of papers, the millions of words, as Tolstoy describes it. Surely, the good life will ensue. So, I think it goes like this, that in the world of learning, the conviction keeps arising again and again, over and over, stimulated by our minor successes, into the thought that a major success will ensue. If you say, what is the major success? The major success would be that maybe by making sense of some competence and knowledge, we'll also be able to make sense of a human life. Surely that's where many of us have properly begun, seeking the sense of a common life. If any of you have ever been stimulated by reading Plato, you can easily feel, momentarily at least, refreshed by his pages. For Plato, living some 2,500 years agone, Plato, that magnificent master, thinker, and conveyor of so many deep matters, Plato contends that a consequence of a modified intelligence will be surely that we'll find the good life. Oh, it comes hard in his pages, the promise of the good life. One of the things that pervades Plato's reflection is a concept of something that's nobly called philosophy. Philosophy, a word that he gives such enormous dignity to. That notion of philosophy is that philosophy is a kind of cultivation of personal life, of your noetic capacities, your knowledge capacities, in which by learning what is beautiful, what is true, what is right, what is just, what is apt to say and to think, that the consequence of that would be a good life. I say to you again, very few passages in world literature have stimulated me as much as those poignant words attributed to Socrates by Plato's pen, in which Socrates, voicing the Platonic themes, talks about philosophy as if it's the love of wisdom, and as if what's available for people who think hard and think cleanly and accurately and rightly, who are not just victims of custom, who are not just byproducts of society, who are not just proponents of commonalities, who are not just full of babble, but whose life has sought integrity and acuteness and clarity and definition. A life like that must be the life of wisdom. And Plato keeps suggesting that something noble like that is still possible. If anything stimulated me as a young person, it was that prospect. Because I knew, as most of you did and do, that there was an awful lot of rubbish in the world, a lot of half-truths that are decked out as esteemed points of view, and much of it is part of the brass and bluff of the world. Plato saw through all that. And he stirs all of us, we read him, to the thought that maybe in finding wisdom and in practicing the great virtues that are therein required, that we too can live a good life. A good life isn't just prosperity, and it isn't just approval of the masses or approval of the elite, but the good life would be the life that's defensible and is strengthened by intelligence and augmented by insight. And that is, I suppose, finally what most of us have thought all along would help us make sense of our lives. I don't know how deeply most of us feel the need for sense in our lives. Some years ago, I was waiting for an airplane in a small airport outside of Cincinnati. It's an airport that had to land in this small little feeder airport and providing feeder airplanes. I was getting out of that plane to go to a small college to give an address later that morning. It was quite early in the morning, 6:30 or so. I stumbled out of this airplane this early hour, and I was standing there, just the pilot telling me that if I stood by such and such a gate, there'd be somebody there, he's sure to pick me up. And he got in the plane and off he went. And I was standing there waiting. Nothing much happened. I was looking about, waiting for somebody to come up. And all of a sudden a man came with a truck. It was a working truck. He looked like a working type man. He wasn't an academic. And as he drove up, he said to me, "Welcome." He says, "Welcome, welcome." And he kept calling me doctor. "Welcome, doctor." So I'm not being too particular about further specification. I was getting hungry and a little weary, and so I thought, well, this is fine. Somebody's giving me a ride. So we got in this truck and off we went. I did think it was a little odd. The man didn't look like a typical dean. But anyway, as we moved along, the man said to me, he said, "Funny nowadays," he says, "how it is." He says, "You haven't had any breakfast, have you?" No, I said. So he said, "Well, let's have breakfast first, and then we can talk." So we got breakfast, and we talked. We were having difficulty in relating to one another. I finally said to him, I said, "Are you the dean?" No, he said, "I'm not the dean." Well, I said, "I'm here to be picked up by the dean of the college for the address I'm giving later in the day." "Oh, no, he says, "I'm here to take semen from my bull, from your bull." So I said to him, "Well, a noble task and defensible and so on." And then he proceeded to tell me how funny this all was. he took me back to another place where there was a telephone, and he called for me. He called the dean of Earlham College, and they found me. The man said, as he walked back, or as we drove back to that little site at Earlham College where he dumped me off, he remarked upon the accident and oddness of the situation, and it chuckled him so much. He chuckled the whole way. I thought about, too, how odd it all was. I was dispensing, as Tolstoy promised, millions or thousands of words. Somebody said, "What are you doing there at that college?" Because the aim of the college was not to take semen from the bull. But the aim of myself was to spew the world with some words, something that was hopefully true and relevant, pertinent, apt, clear, supposedly. Now, if you said again, what's the condition under which we can make sense of a life? One of the answers is you can make sense of a life if you have knowledge. And the reputation of knowledge has been enhanced not just by the content of the knowledge, because most people don't always care so much for the knowledge, as rather its reputation and its efficaciousness in producing other things. So, but still the reputation of knowledge is very great. Those personal competencies that make up knowledge looks like it's going to edge you towards the truth. And if you're edged towards the truth, looks as if you're going to be edged also maybe into a good life. And the promise of the life of learning has invariably been, for most of us, that this is how we come to live the good life. And I must say, I wish it were true. I wish it were true. I'd like to have the quiet satisfaction that would come from the possession of the truth and the thought that the possession of the truth would mean the flowering of the good life. But I've lived too long in the world of knowledge, in the commercial side of learning, where we've learned how to teach it and to augment the qualities of teaching, pedagogy, the tricks of pedagogy. We've all learned about that. And one of the consequences, instead of the knowledge producing the goodness of life, instead it seems to me oftentimes that it's multiplied the sorrow of knowledge, sorrow of life. And that sorrow of life has exacted a kind of terrible price in many cases. One of the pleasures I had as a student is to read the pages of Ernst Cassir's life and teaching of Immanuel Kant, Cassir's masterpiece work. Not only did I read it, but I dissected it word by word with the old man there, making corrections sort of day after day as we discussed the text of his own biography of Immanuel Kant. And Cassir himself was so moved by the life history of Immanuel Kant that sometimes his voice would quiver as he talked about that magnificent thinker, Immanuel Kant. Then he told us on one occasion, and I subsequently read his poignant passages where he writes this up in his Life of Kant. But the passage goes like this. Immanuel Kant was 80 years of age. He was still extremely alert, cognizant of all sorts of things. He was putting together what he called the architectonics of knowledge, putting together the principles of knowledge that sort of governed almost everything as he thought it. But as Cassirer describes Kant's doing this, he then tells us about Kant and how Kant, at the age of 84, was becoming physically frail and having some difficulty standing and moving about. And on one occasion, a doctor came to visit Kant, and he discovered that Kant was almost immobile in his bed. But of a sudden, the doctor, he said, "Are you speaking of the post?" And the doctor was confused and said, Post. He didn't know what the philosopher was speaking of. And so he hesitated, and then Kant was in kind of irritation at the interruption to his thoughts, said, "Yes, the post. And they confused the doctor and they confused the listeners. And finally they caught on to the fact that Kant was insisting that he stand up, and so he pulled himself up and stood at full height. And he stood there quavering and quaking in his weakness. And everyone was astounded. And then all of a sudden it became clear that what Kant meant. Kant thought that the doctor was a person of some social status. He was a doctor. He was of social status. And because he held a noble post, that it was Kant's duty to stand up in the presence of that great man, the doctor. And when this was ascertained by the doctor and by the participants in the conversation, everyone was quite shocked at such nobility, but it was all made more austere by the fact that Kant himself said, and alarmed everyone by the acuity of his remark, before he said, "The sense of humanity has not left me yet." And then he crumbled and fell to the floor. Now, Kant thought that the symptom of the good life would be when somebody could manage his own existence well enough so that that sense of humanity would never leave you, would always be there. And if you had that sense of humanity, by which I think Kant meant that if you became a good person who had a sense of humanity that never left you, that sense of humanity would be an achievement of the good life. I think that's the secret of Kant's philosophy. Kant thought that if you put the abstruse reflections of somebody thinking out the nature of the physical world, the physics of the day, the science of the day, the geography of the day, the history of the day, and if you understood all that, as Kant thought he was trying to do, that the sense of humanity would shape up the fragmented character of a human life, shape it up, wouldn't be undone by illness or by accident, but the shape of the humanity would be such that a good life would ensue. That, in a peculiar way, was what Kant thought was the making of a good life. Now, many of us today, and many people following Kant, now understand that in respect to Kant himself, that the shining character of the good life was not as Kant said it was, namely a function of his abstract learning. Kant thought it all came because of the architectonics of the principles of learning that he had grasped in a lifetime of effort. Kant himself thought that. He thought that that good life, that truly was part of his good life, he thought it was a function of his command of the architectonics of discursive learning, which he'd been amassing for 70 years of his life. I think he was mistaken on where it came from. I think that humaneness in his life, that sense of humanity which he talked about, was not a function of other kinds of learning, but instead it was the function of his own personality. His personality was winning out. And there are very few people who have such a command of their own person that they can say anything like that on their own behalf. The number is terribly small. And even Kant, I think, gives a mistaken notion of where that sense of humanity comes from. Kant himself, thinking about all this, thought that that sense of humanity grew up in people because of enlightenment. And he thought the enlightenment, of which he was so proud, companion too. He thought that that enlightenment had caused that sense of humanity to prosper. It's like he didn't believe that the moral life had a bottom on which he could stand. It had its bottom, so to speak, in all the other domains of learning. Well, there are thousands of people who've been looking like Kant did for a way in which the sense of humanity might flower in them. And at least I, for one, have always hoped that the sense of humanity would be something that my own teaching would be conducive to, in myself and in others. But I'm not very sure of that any longer. Let me just add a word, and that is that there's another kind of another peculiar consideration that has struck me in a variety of circumstances, a variety of places, and a variety of occasions. And it's like this, that the endeavor to forge a good life, to realize the great desideratum, the object of deepest desire in most of us, that we succeed to a life of which we could have, about which we could have pride and confidence and regard, of which we could be proud. That strikes me as being a fundamental wish, a wish that hardly has to be taught, but it's sort of dimly realized in most of us through much of our lives. And it's attested to, if not by our successes, by the poignancy of our failures. But in the middle of all that, through many years of reflecting about myself, I thought about something else, and that is that respecting something that if we dare call it religion, if we dare call it maybe even Christian religion, a peculiar note is occasionally struck. And that occasional note, which sometimes has a chorus accompanying it, but often has to be sung by each of us, sometimes alone. It's like this, that there is a thought that maybe there is a God. And if there's a God who loves and cares for each of us, and with whose existence our enthusiasm for a good life is stimulated rather than thwarted. Oh, but be that as it may, the thought of there being such a thing or such a person available to us as a God, as the God, has this effect, namely that that God is like an eternal contemporary, close to all of us, proximate to all of us, and that in moments of integrity and honesty and self-awareness, that in moments like that, we suddenly can become aware that we are not alone. And because we are not alone, there is for all of us a God who cares for us if there is that, now, if you dare to think the thought, if you dare to think the thought, there is a God available for each of us. And if there is that God available for each of us, then it might be like this, that in our own striving, this God can become our teacher. And if we let ourselves be taught by a teacher who is God, then living before that God is the kind of secret of our life. If we're being invited to live before God, oh, that might be extraordinary. Maybe some of us have lived for 5 minutes of our life in the presence of a queen or a king or a great philosopher, as was my case with David Swenson and with Ernst Cassirer. But what if it's also possible that we're all being invited to live before a God and to live on intimate terms before God? Because what if God is different than all other creatures? By being available for this intimacy that only a full self-consciousness can provide, well, then to soul live is to have another kind of possibility altogether in your life. It's a possibility that might mean that instead of demanding that learning have its fruition in the good life, or that the good life have its fruition in the maximizing of one's vagabondish existence. Instead of that, what if it's the case that by working, if I dare say so, on ourselves, becoming clear about what we are, integrated, clarified about who we are and what we are, if we become like that, then it might be also that there's the possibility of knowing God, and knowing God as your teacher. I've thought most of my life about how difficult it is to make sense. My life has been a rebellion, modified and polite looking, but a very deep rebellion. And the Christian life suggests something else, that the bloody road that Wittgenstein talked about, that all of us must travel on, the bloody road. We have no right to anything but the bloody road, which is one of the things he said on one occasion. None of us have a right to anything but the bloody road. what if one dares to believe in God? And we're invited to live before him and live on intimate terms with him. And it's, I guess it's like another calling. It's like a beckoning from another mode of life and existence. And maybe in that kind of context, the sense of a life becomes not so much an achievement as it does a sheer act of God's graciousness. I guess that's what it would mean to live and to work in faith. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And we'll take just a few moments for questions here. And so that the questions may be heard by everyone and get on the tape recording, I'll attempt to repeat the essence of them from this microphone. I know it's hard to be first, but who has a question formulated or halfway formulated? Yes.
Dr. Paul Holmer. Kierkegaard, of course, very simplified, gave us three stages of life's way: aesthetic, moral, and spiritual. Would you want to put knowledge in the same categories as knowledge is aesthetic?
Well, the question...
Well, would you like to repeat the question? Go ahead.
The question is whether the aesthetics and the ethical and the religious stages that are being discussed here would be something that I'd like to place in the... Did you ask me to...
The knowledge itself.
Oh, does knowledge, yes.
Just follow the same category.
Yes, what does knowledge have to do with that? Well, I guess we'd have to say something else about that would augment what I said earlier. The odd thing is that in Plato's case, the attempt to fill out a life of, or to supplement a life of ignorance, or supplement a life by slaughtering one's ignorance and providing intelligibility, looks like a kind of a linear development. And I think many people have thought about the possibility of a life acquiring sense over a period of growth and a period of adaptation and learning. And so many people have, therefore, including Plato and including Immanuel Kant, they thought that the good life would come if you got that architectonics worked out. Now, Kierkegaard thought about that too, and he thought that such a view, that there'd be a linear completion to a life by maximizing knowledge and realizing opportunity. He thought that was wrong. And that's why he said that there are some, what he called, sometimes he uses various terms, but he calls them stadia på livets väg, the stages on life's way. And the stages on life's way are not linear developments, but they are created by what people choose to do with themselves. Wittgenstein said on one occasion that sometimes the problems of philosophy turn out to be problems of thought that one has about himself. The way to work on those problems is to work on yourself. Wittgenstein said that. And Kierkegaard's notion was that the way you solve the issues of getting sense to your life was not by accumulating this miscellany of knowledge or even the architectonics of knowledge, but by utilizing the powers and the things that you were, but modifying the how you treated yourself. If you treat yourself aesthetically, as a kind of an aesthetic agent, if you treat yourself as an ethical agent, if you treat yourself as a religious subject, an agent, the consequences will be different in each case. And therefore, an aesthete would be different than an ethical man. An ethical man would be different than a religious man. And then now you've got a real fundamental choice. And then those choices is another way to think about the whole business of making sense out of a life. There's no single answer, but there's a meaningful choice of possibilities.
Who else?
Well, if I've quieted the riot in human hearts, that's... oh, here I haven't. Yes. Elvie.
How can the university and the teachers nudge or help students to go into this quest, making sense of life and learning?
The question is, how can the university nudge people, to nudge students toward making sense of life and learning?
Well, I wish I knew, because universities are so promiscuous places, such variegated outfits with so many, with a plurality of aims and purposes. I don't know what to make of it myself. I don't know what to make of that kind of environment. So if you said, how does it happen, therefore, that someone can become a serious person and discover this sort of glory? And how can one find that glory? Well, can we be nudged into it? Nudged is probably the best word, rather than educated into it. If people are going to be educated into it, they're going to be conditioned. They're going to be tamped down and formed by the pressures of the day and so on. But I would think that maybe the better way to think about this is to say that if someone sees radically what it is to become a deeply moral being, and if someone should discover the peculiar happiness that comes from doing your duty, and the joy of that, I would think that's that's not a religious conversion, but it's a moral conversion. And that's a serious business. That's still different than a religious conversion. Being religiously converted would be converted not just by the possibility of moral authenticity, but being educated by God. So, of course, in that case, you need something so homely as a preacher who tells you about it. And you need sometimes just not so much learning as testimony. Story that somebody's told you. And then finding ways to make that story right on this occasion and for that person is a part of the poignancy and pathos of and good fun of being a Christian, in addition, for example, to being learned. It's fun to be learned too. Awful lot. It's really great to be part of the setup. But being part of the setup is nothing like being what if you are accorded the dignity of being a child of God? And if someone dares to think that about you, that you are a child of God, well, that's greater than being smiled at by the king or queen. Mm-hmm. Most people are so content with 5 minutes in the presence of the queen. They'll never forget it the rest of their life. Well, if you dare to think the Christian theme is that, hey, we're all in the presence, immediate presence of God Almighty. Can't afford to forget him, his existence for a moment. And if we remember his existence, it's like the good life is right at hand.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just wondered if part of the pursuit of knowledge is that kind of the problem of trying to find the answers within ourselves, and the answers aren't there.
The question is whether the people who are looking for the answers and the answers aren't there. I don't know. You know, with the enthusiasm that one has for learning, one has to also learn modesty, the modesty that goes with the learning. So somebody learns something that has a shiny magnificence about it, but that magnificence doesn't last very long. And that's the way it is with the life of learning too. The life of learning is full of fashion and popularity contests and isms and all that sort of stuff. So none of those big truths that are proffered are lasting endurance and lasting significance. So one has to have a tremendous sense of humor about all of it. That's the way it is in the world of learning. Sometimes a big joke. But a lovely joke. It's great fun to share it.
Thank you. Yes, another.
Talking about sharing, as you know, there is another German immigrant who came here, Alfred Schütz, who didn't have the fortune to make a living as a philosopher. He was a banker partially in New York and a new school. He wrote a good deal, he's a student of Husserl, of course. He wrote a good deal of music, and he wrote a piece that deals with being attuned to each other. It's a wonderful piece about what string quartets do. When I heard you speak, I thought to myself, I wonder if he writes about playing Mozart. I know many people, Dilthey, Barth, who always go to Mozart and wonder, and then isn't that ability to somehow discover in playing a part that there is a tuning. I'm being tuned, and thereby does that help sort of as an undergirding for making sense, to be allowed to be tuned the way a string quartet plays with each other?
I think your eloquence on this issue takes care of itself. And I think
are we going to repeat the...
No, we're not going to repeat.
At least we haven't attempted comparing a string quartet of Schütz to what we're talking about.
But I'm struck by your own competence in so many arenas there that allow you to formulate these issues for yourself. I'd have to spend a lot of time just unpacking your question and restating your question. I just can't do that right now. But it's not because of that. It might be enormously worthwhile. I undoubtedly would be. But I'm tired now.
Well, that sounds like a call to move on to the next stage. Before we adjourn, we do have a brief personal word of appreciation by Reverend Glenn Weiberg, who's pastor emeritus of Salem Covenant Church.
Birthdays, especially the big ones, provide us with the occasion to say things to one another that we do not ordinarily say. And in so doing, we honor friendships of long standing, but in ways which a Hallmark card cannot convey. Thinking of my own friendship with Paul and all that he has given me and all of us who know him, a short piece by J.B. Priestley comes to mind. If I were an American, I should make my remembrance of the Grand Canyon the final test of men, of art, of policies. I should ask myself, is this good enough to exist in the same country as the canyon? How would I feel about this kind of art or these political measures if I were near that rim? Every member or office of the federal government ought to remind himself with triumphant pride that he is on the staff of the Grand Canyon. And I must add that whether in a lecture or a sermon or a group discussion or personal conversation, you have, Paul, sooner or later brought all of us, your friends, your students, to the rim of the canyon, evoking in us the power and the beauty and the grandeur of the sublime, both in ourselves and in the Holy One, blessed be He. And your tenure on the staff of the Canyon is and will ever be uncontested. And on your 80th birthday, your Thursday book discussion club wants to present you with flowers and with cards. Hallmark. We're not in a... We're not in a church basement or church social hall, but I think it's appropriate we sing Happy Birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Paul. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
Well, we have birthday cake out in the atrium.
Well, that was nice.